Welcome to Burbage Heritage Group's August meeting, The History of Pugh's Paddock in Burbage. Prior to the lockdown, Pugh's Paddock was to be the subject of our July meeting. We were going to have PIMS in the paddock. Unfortunately, that hasn't materialised, and so we have an online PIMS in the paddock evening about Pugh's Paddock. The paddock history has for many centuries been the same as that of Moat House. This triangular shaped piece of land, 2,022 square yards, has been the same shape and size from this first 1581 map. No records show that it was ever used for anything other than a small enclosed field or paddock. During the 1500s, the Whiteman family, who were very prominent in the village at the time, built a prestigious house alongside this site. And then in the 1750s, a Coventry wine merchant named David Wells purchased the house and surrounding lands. The house at this time was called Hall House. One of the Wells's improvements to the property was to create a sizable pleasure grounds, including the construction of a dry moat which ran along the north and western edges of the garden. The moat also served the purpose of keeping out stray animals from the village, and the name of the property evolved into the Moat House. With the construction of the moat, the triangular piece of land was separated from the Moat House grounds and became a paddock or a small field for horticulture. Wells decided to divert the ancient right-of-way footpath to Hinckley that passed parallel with the new moat. That's the footpath that would have run from the Horsepool across Grove, what is now Grove Road, and becomes the Lash Hill path. In the 1780s, New Road was constructed to divert the public from passing close to the front of the house. However, the public footpath still remained on the upper paddock area. David Wells Sr. died in 1757, leaving the property to his son, also David, to continue with some improvements. In 1795, the paddock area was sold to Lady Jemima Lucas, Lady of the Manor, and that land just remained a paddock for the next 110 years. David Wells Jr. died in 1816, and Moat House is inherited by a nephew, Andrew Salisbury, who sells the land in 51 lots. The Moat House, with its Georgian facade, is sold to the Burbage rector, the Reverend Jerome Dyke, and Moat House becomes known as the Rectory. The Reverend Dyke is rector from 1797 to 1837. Very handsome looking man. The rectory continues as the home of subsequent rectors. In 1883, the Reverend J.P.A. Fletcher becomes the 38th rector of Burbage. Surprisingly for a cleric, he was a good horseman, and it is said he could turn a horse and carriage around the turning circle of the rectory, holding the reins with one hand. He gave riding lessons and kept a good stable of horses who grazed in the paddock. After Fletcher's death in 1916, he was succeeded by the Reverend Richard Pughe. In 1919, Balliol College is given the glebe lands of Burbage, handed down by inheritance from the Gray family by the then Baroness Lucas, Mrs. Nan Eno Cooper, in memory of her brother, Auberon Thomas Herbert, who was killed in 1916 flying with the Royal Flying Corps. Auberon had been a student at Balliol College. The tithes from this gift went to St. Catherine's Church, making it a very rich living. Reverend Pugh's on the left-hand side there, and again on the right-hand picture, but a very much later time. The economic depression after World War I resulted in the fall in land values, and in 1940, the Church Ecclesiastical Commissioners and Balliol College began to sell off pockets of land around the village. The Paddock was one of these, and it was sold to William Pughe in June 1940. Living at Hogue Hall, William was the elder brother of Rector Richard Pughe. He was a well-known sheep breeder in Wales, making a considerable living exporting lambs to America and Australia. William kept horses at the Paddock, which commonly became known as Pugh's Paddock. And in World War II, the land was cultivated in the Dig for Victory campaign. In 1947, the rectory was sold by the Ecclesiastical Commissioners, except for a portion of land to be retained for building a new rectory and a slip of land to widen Grove Road. A condition of the sale was that it could no longer be called the rectory, but would revert to the name of Moat House. Ownership of the Paddock once again became part of the Moat House estate, when William Pughe, who had purchased the Paddock, purchased the Moat House for £3,150. And shortly before his death, in August 1948, William left all his estate of over £9,000, including the Paddock, to his only surviving sibling, Rector Richard Pughe. We move on now to December 1953, when 2 time capsules were buried in a brick-lined vault on the green in front of the manor house, next to a plot of land allocated for the planting of a copper beech the following spring to commemorate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. At the conclusion of that ceremony, the deeds of the Paddock were presented by the rector, the Reverend Pughe, to the chair of the Burbage Coronation Celebrations Committee, Councillor Thomas McGaw, who accepted on behalf of Hinckley Urban District Council. The Paddock could only be used as a garden of recreation. In 1954, Rector Pughe planted an oak tree donated by George Geary of the Burbage Nurseries in the Paddock. That is the oak tree. Rector Pughe died in May 1955. As he had no heirs, the old rectory and lands was held in probate to be administered by Herbert Saunders and Thomas Goodwin, 2 Burbage church wardens. His estate was valued at £29,033, 2 shillings and 10 pence. In October of that year, a 2-day sale was held to sell the contents of Moat House, but we don't know how much it raised. In 1956, Moat House is demolished. The property had been sold to the county or local borough council. The once beautiful gardens become overgrown and stagnate while the councils debate over the fate of the area. Fortunately, the Paddock, as it had been given as a deed of gift to Burbage, remained untouched until 1958. Then the Urban District Council undertook the responsibility to turn the Paddock into a garden, and landscaping by John Dickinson contractors and the Borough Park Department began. Finally, 5 years after the donation of the Paddock by Reverend Pughe, on the evening of the 24th of July 1958, the opening ceremony took place. At the opening, Councillor Tom McGrath outlined the events in which the gift was made and spoke of the work that had been put into it to make it a thing of beauty and a joy forever. Chairman of the council, Councillor Deering, declared the paddock open and said that although it had cost a lot of money, it had provided a delightful part of Burbage where older residents could find pleasant and restful relaxation. Some existing hedges were used, but the majority of the plantings were from 1958 and were donations from villagers. The council had obviously landscaped the area and put in the paths. The villagers' gifts were: the Burbage nurseries gave 12 flowering trees. The Burbage Hosiery Company 7 dozen floribunda roses, along with 3 dozen from the women's section of the Burbage British Legion. Harry Tunnicliffe, one of the older villagers who had planted the coronation tree in '54, donated shrubs, which are still there. Dorothy Atkins of the manor donated 50 holly bushes, which are on the Grove Road side of the paddock. Magnolia trees were donated by councillors Tom McGrath and Keith Wileman. The family of Victor Davis, who had fallen in World War II, also donated a magnolia, and one can still be seen in the top corner of the shrubbery. Of the 4 original seats, 2 were donated by the family of the late James Robinson. The Burbage Darts League donated a 3rd, and Mrs. Craythorne of the Anchor Inn the 4th. The bird bath, which is no longer there, was donated by the family of the late Joseph Colkin, a hosiery manufacturer of Coventry Road. At the end of the opening ceremony, Councillor McGrath mentioned the fact that what was now wanted was a pagoda for the old folk to shelter when the weather was not good, and he appealed for financial assistance for one. And this is a lovely picture from around 1965, showing a very young Paul Williams with his sister and the then junior school in the background, in front of the floribunda roses donated by the Burbage Hosiery Company and the women of Burbage British Legion. In 1972, a summer house was built. This was dedicated to the memory of Dr. Charles O'Donovan, who had been the village doctor for 44 years and had died the previous year. Edith Wheelock, aged 92, in the centre of the picture, a resident of the Moat House care home, which had been built in the 1960s by Leicestershire County Council, unveiled the plaque in memory of the doctor. Miss Wheelock appealed, "I ask the boys and girls to think of the elderly and not to break the windows." The plaque that she unveiled can still be seen on the information board in Pugh's paddock. Over the years, the shelter and paddock became a haven not for the elderly, but for the youths of the village. The shelter was eventually demolished and the paddock fell into disrepair. In 1997, the Burbage Parish Council, which had been re-established in 1986, began a series of improvements to the paddock. Power to the old lamppost was disconnected and new railings and gates installed to discourage nighttime gatherings. In 2000, a tree was planted to commemorate the millennium, along with hundreds of bulbs planted by children from the infant school. By 2005, new hard standing and benches replaced the old concrete ones. Graham Jackson, a speaker at one of the Heritage Group meetings in 2005, mentioned that the land adjoining the paddock where the infant school now stands was the Centre for Genetic Research by Charles Chamberlain Hurst, the owner of Burbage Nurseries. The Hursts lived at the Grove across the road from the paddock in what is now Grosvenor Crescent. This started a project to find the Burbage bred roses from the nurseries and also from the Robinson Victoria nurses to plant in the paddock. Out of the hundreds of roses bred by the nurserymen, only 4 were still commercially available, and beds of these were planted in early 2007. The two Burbage nurseries were Rosa Coriana, bred at Cambridge in 1926 by Charles Chamberlain Hurst, looking very dapper in his territorial officer's uniform. It was named after Reginald Corrie, a keen amateur rose collector and wealthy Welsh industrialist, who endowed funds for the botanical gardens at Cambridge. Hurst worked with Corrie's wife, Rosa Kester, at Cambridge. The other Chamberlain Hurst rose was Cantabriensis, bred from wild roses from research by Hurst in 1931. The two Robinson roses that we found were Christopher Stone, bred in 1934. Christopher Stone was the first person to play records on the BBC in 1927. A musician and historic music enthusiast, he published a book of sea songs in 1923 and persuaded the BBC to play recordings with introductions by himself. He proved to be a popular broadcaster and caught the attention of Herbert Robinson, who was an avid opera fan. And the other rose we planted was Doreen, bred in 1951. Doreen Margaret was Herbert Robinson's daughter, born in 1922 and died 1981. Doreen worked with her father for many years at the Victoria nurseries. Later, the rose Mandy, also bred by Robinsons in 1963, was located in a private garden in the village. Rosemary Gandy was from the North Kilworth Roses, propagated these, and we were able to create another bed in 2008, along with permanent metal plaques for all the roses. Also in 2007, funding was sought to provide an information board on the horticultural heritage of Burbage. The board illustrates the history of the paddock and information on the rose-growing heritage, along with recognition of Bill Truslove and his contribution to sweet pea growing. Descendants of Hurst, Robinson and Truslove families were traced, along with former workers from the nurseries. The plaque was unveiled on a gloriously sunny day on the 7th of July 2007, when John Robbins welcomed guests from all parts of the country. The picture shows John Robbins on the right, John Gent, Herbert Robinson's nephew, on the left, Tamara and Francesca Hurst, Charles Chamberlain's granddaughters, Nicola and Isaac Ratchford, Bill Truslove's granddaughter, and a great-grandson. Tamara and Francesca Hurst unveiled a plaque to their grandfather, Charles Chamberlain Hurst, at the infant school. And refreshments followed in the school, and Sylvia gave a presentation on the history of the paddock. Tamara and Francesca. In 2009, new heritage footpath signs were cast for 3 paths in the centre of the village. The heritage group were consulted, and Pugh's path was named for the ancient track at the side of the paddock. Various other improvements followed over the years. To celebrate the Queen's 60th anniversary ascension in 2012, Burbage Parish Council provided 6 Elizabeth maple trees to be planted by representatives of the community groups. At the paddock, a tree was planted by Brenda Ray, the president of Burbage Women's Institute, and Richard Fleming, chair of Burbage Parish Council. In 2013, veterans suggested that the World War I memorial lamppost, which had stood in the Wesleyan Chapel car park for many, many years, should be restored in time for the centenary of World War I. With parish council funding, apprentices restore the post and construct a new electric lantern to replace the original one. The lamp was dedicated in time for the commemoration of the outbreak of World War I in 2014 and placed in the Paddock. I now hand over to His Royal Highness.
2 years ago, I launched the Fields and Trust Centenary Fields programme in Coventry. And as we reach the midway point of the commemorative period for the Great War, Fields and Trust continues to build a living legacy to the fallen by protecting Centenary Fields forever as places for play, sport and recreation. At this time of year, formal acts of remembrance become a major part of our public life. This remembrance is often focused at the war memorials of village greens and town centres throughout the country, and in some cases in parks such as this, the Kensington Memorial Park, opened by Princess Louise 90 years ago. Today, in keeping with the original intent of the park, we rededicate this land as a space of public remembrance, a centenary field. This and scores like it across the UK will honour the fallen of World War I by safeguarding forever memorial parks and gardens as public spaces to be valued and enjoyed by their local community. Fields and Trust is proud to be partnering with the Royal British Legion in delivering this project across the country and encouraging us all during this significant period of history to rethink remembrance. I take this opportunity to thank the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea for their support for this programme. In the 2 years remaining until the anniversary of Armistice Day, Fields and Trust will be working with more local authorities, such as this one, to secure even more recreational spaces at Centenary Fields. They will succeed, but only if they have help. So I urge others to support this important cause and protect these living spaces of remembrance for generations to come. Now I'm delighted to dedicate Kensington Memorial Park as a centenary field.
In 2016, Burbage Parish Council nominated Pugh's Paddock as an area to be recognised as a field in trust to safeguard the site for posterity, and a plaque was received in 2017. The lamppost has now become a fitting focal point for local schools' Remembrance Service, which is held annually the Friday before Remembrance Sunday. And during this COVID epidemic of 2020, the Paddock has continued to fulfil the wishes of Rector Pughe to provide a quiet, restful and peaceful place in the centre of our beautiful village.